Welcome. I'm Michael Higgins, the Associate Director of Marketing at Harvard Education Press, and I want to thank you for joining Harvard Education Press's webinar, Students and Climate Change, Empowering Action. We're pleased to have three of our authors with us for this panel discussion, but let me first go over a few things. We're going to have time at the end of the webinar for questions of our panelists. Chat has been disabled. So if you want to put any questions into the Q&A, we'll also have a recording of the webinar available, and we'll send that out to everyone who's registered. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Tom Roderick is a teacher, writer, and education activist in New York City. He retired in 2019 after 36 years as founding executive director of Morningside Center for Teaching Social Responsibility. He is the founder of the Teach for Climate Justice Project and the author of Teach for Climate Justice, A Vision for Transforming Education. Laura Schifter is a senior fellow at the Aspen Institute, where she founded and directs This is Planet Ed, an initiative to unlock the power of education as a force for climate action. She is also a lecturer on education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and serves on the Committee on Climate Education at Harvard University. She is the co-author of Students, Schools, and Our Climate Moment, Acting Now to Secure Our Future. And Mark Windschitl is a professor of science teaching and learning at the University of Washington. He is the author of Teaching Climate Change, Fostering Understanding, Resilience, and a Commitment to Justice, as well as being the co-author of Ambitious Science Teaching. Mark, I'll turn it over to you to lead the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Michael. I've been asked to be the moderator and a participant, so I'll play both roles here. And I know everybody likes to just start off, and so that's what I'm going to do. The first question, and I'm going to ask Laura this question. Writing books like ours is a project of passion and commitment. During the time that we were putting ideas together, I'm assuming that we all had conversations with young people and adults and had chances to observe up close some events that made us think, wow, I should write about this. Can both of you share a story about a person or situation that has stayed with you, whether it made it into your book or not? And I'm going to start with Laura.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mark. And thank you all for being here today. Really excited to have this conversation. I'd love to start by actually talking about how I got into working on these issues. You know, I would say 6, 7 years ago, I didn't really care about climate change that much. Yes, if somebody had told me, is that an issue that people should care about? I would have said yes, but I thought that that was a problem for people working in the environment to handle. And I worked in education. We have enough problems in education to handle that I didn't see climate change as an issue that was really critically important to me. It was something far off in the future for my children's children's children, but not something that impacted me. And there are 3 days in my life where I am wandering this world as one person. Something happens to me on that day, and the next day I become somebody else. The first day that happened to me was February 28th, 2013, when my oldest daughter was born, and I became forever a different person as a mother. Shortly thereafter, a few months later, we lost my brother-in-law suddenly. And that was the first day I ever experienced the overwhelming power of grief and what it is like to walk this world experiencing grief. And then the next time this happened to me was October 8th, 2018. And I was sitting with my 3 children in the basement. And all of a sudden, I got news alert after news alert after news alert. We had a decade left to address climate change to avoid the most devastating impacts. And everything I had experienced with motherhood and grief hit me in that moment as I was looking at my 3 children playing in the basement. I realized the misconceptions that I had held about climate change, and that it was an issue that was not only going to impact their future, but it was going to impact their lives now. Everything I had been doing in education felt meaningless because we could have the best education system in the world, and it wouldn't matter if the full impacts of climate change took hold. And I knew I had to figure out what it was that I could do to contribute somehow to solutions on this issue. After several months of working, I ended up realizing that there was a lot that I could bring with my expertise in education to start thinking about what it was that we could do on issues of climate change. I ended up making my way to the Aspen Institute to found an initiative, which is now This is Planet Ed, where we work across early childhood, K through 12, higher ed, and children's media to empower young people to succeed in our changing climate. And through the course of doing this work, I have met individuals all across the country who have had climate moments themselves. And maybe it's one thing led them to realize something else, or maybe it was a series of things that led them to that moment. But they've had these awakenings too, realizing the urgency of climate change, realizing the desire to be a part of the solution. And they've worked with people within their communities to do that. And that was what we wanted to talk about in this book. Were those people's climate moments, were the steps that they've taken to action. Whether it's a school board member in Prince George's County who we talk about, who led a collaborative effort to push their school district to develop climate action plans themselves, or a superintendent who started a solar initiative in his school district in Batesville, Arkansas, and used the savings to go to increase teacher pay. There are people all across the country that are engaged in doing this work. And actually, that is one of the things that really resonated with me in writing this book, is the impact that individuals can have when they start talking about this issue, remain committed to learning and working on it collaboratively. And that's what we try to outline in this book.
Mhm. Okay, thanks, Laura. I'm sure we're going to pick up that thread of the impact that individuals can have. That will be with us for the next hour. So thanks for leading off. Tom, how about you? Was there something during the course of writing your book that just stuck with you, or you thought, boy, I need to include this?
Sure. Yes, one of the people I interviewed for my book is Jasmine, a teacher in Oregon. She teaches literature and composition to high school students. And she begins her classes by asking, "How is your heart today? What do you need from the community today?" And she says that the climate crisis comes up when there's been a climate disaster, or the students get some bad news about climate. And she says it weighs on them. They want to talk about it. And the thing that she's most concerned about is that the students seem to be expressing a lack of trust in adults, not just government officials, but all adults. They seem to be saying, "This is our future. Does anybody care?" Now, of course, Jasmine cares, and most teachers care, even though conditions in our schools often make it difficult to express our caring. But despite those conditions, we need to let our students know we care, as Jasmine does by starting off her classes by saying, "How is your heart today?" And we also need to show them we care by making climate justice education an integral part of their education in school.
Okay, thank you, Tom, for sharing that. I think my story will kind of pick up on some of the ideas that you just expressed about caring. When I was writing my book, I had the opportunity to visit for a few weeks a seventh grade teacher who works north of Seattle in a diverse middle school. And she was teaching the seventh grade class about climate change, the first climate change course that she had taught and that the kids had likely ever experienced. And she wanted to help kids understand both climate change from a global perspective and a local perspective or a humanistic perspective. And so she had kids on one of the first couple days of the unit. Um, I was embedded in that classroom, and she had kids draw out a model of what they thought was happening with the greenhouse effect on the left side of a big sheet of paper. And so kids made their attempts to draw out what they thought was happening with fossil fuel emissions and what was happening with the amplification of the greenhouse effect. But on the right side of the model, the teacher had given them a little brief a few minutes earlier about an Alaskan village of an Inuit community north of the Arctic Circle. And this community depended upon sea ice. They lived on an island, and most of the village was built right on the edge of the island, and they depended on sea ice both for cultural practices and for subsistence. And they really needed sea ice in the spring and the fall seasons because it helped buffer their island from the impacts of waves from the ocean. But what was happening was, the teacher put it this way, that the sea ice was declining year by year, and that those ocean waves were beginning to undermine the shore on which this village was built. And so the kids get busy with their models and they're trying to draw, and this class is always buzzing. It's always got conversation going. The kids are really energetic. And the teacher says, oh, and by the way, I've got a picture of the village. And so the kids stop for a moment and she projects a photo of this Inuit village. And what you see are three homes that used to be like 20 yards back from the shore of the island. But the shore has kind of come up to meet these homes. It's been washed away by the waves of the ocean because there's too little sea ice. And there were a couple of the homes were literally tipped over and falling into the ocean. And there were two kids in the photo standing and looking at these buildings, and they were about the same age as the kids in this classroom. When she showed that picture, the whole classroom went silent. And I could tell it was the first time I ever felt that some learning must be happening right now. And it's not learning by talking, it's learning by being silent and maybe putting yourself in the shoes of somebody else, maybe a community that's being impacted by climate change in a way that we in this country are not. We in this country are buffered from the worst impacts of climate change, and that's what makes it hard to convince some people, some teachers, that we really have to be teaching about it. I also thought in that moment how complicated now the task is for what we're asking teachers to do in classrooms, both to teach about the science mechanics that are on the left side of the kids' model, the greenhouse effect, but also teaching about the emotional impact, the impacts on communities thousands of miles away on the right side of their model. So I thought that was an unusual juxtaposition for her. But that really made me think. Anybody else want to pick up on, add anything to their comments? All right, I can go on to the next question. So all three of us argue that education is going to be a major lever for social change and how we respond to our environmental crises. There's climate change, there's the breakdown of biodiversity, and pollution. They're all three, like we got a poly crisis going on. But all three of us argue in different ways that education is a big lever for social change. Can you say why it has such potential for impact and perhaps how we can make it real rather than theoretical? And I'll just throw that out there to either one of you want to reply.
I'm happy to jump in. I think it's funny, working in the climate space now, when you hear people talk about climate solutions, I'll always hear people talk about, renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, sustainable manufacturing, or even policy change. They'll talk about these things that are other, and they won't connect the dots that the thing that is needed for all of those things to work is people. It's people to, create the renewable energy and demand it. It's people who need to make sure they're allowing it to be built in their community. People got us into this mess, and it's going to have to be people that get us out. And we actually have to focus on building the capacity of people to do that. And right now, we are not doing that sufficiently enough. We just released a survey a couple weeks ago looking at youth climate literacy, and only 54% of young people understood our emissions related to human activity as being the main driver of climate change. Only 1 in 3 saw it as impacting the areas where they live now. And most people thought the biggest solution that they could advance was recycling. And we are, not teaching climate change in about 19 states within science class, let alone teaching it across the other areas that we know are critical in actually building our societal capacity to do this, whether it's through social studies or economics or health or whatever it might be. And so right now, as educators, we're really failing to prepare them for success in the world that they are living them in. Our world is being fundamentally shaped by climate change, and we have an obligation to prepare students for success in that world. And we are not doing that right now, and we really need to step up and start doing that.
Yeah, I think when kids and adults think about what we need to do to combat climate change, their mind goes to wind turbines and electric vehicles first, right? But those of us who've been in this business for a while, writing about it, studying it, know that social change is going to be the driver for everything else. And unless you get people more knowledgeable and on board, it's not going to work. We have to get that 10%, that 15% of the population to get super engaged, because that's what research says can get us to that social tipping point where norms start really shifting about how we consume, how we treat the environment, how we think about desirable futures for our kids, and what we want to do now to plan for that.
And one thing that's a real barrier. Oh, sorry, Tom, you can go.
Yes. So yes, just wanted to say that, research shows that young people, a large percentage of young people are anxious about the climate crisis. They are frightened of what is coming in the world, and many feel helpless to do anything about it. And that's what we need to address as educators. Global warming, species extinction, and rampant inequality are going to be the main factors shaping the lives of all the children now in school and for the foreseeable future. They, in turn, through no fault of their own, their generation will bear a large part of the responsibility for saving what we can save. A lot of harm has already been done to our beautiful planet and our life support system. And so the generation that's now in school is going to bear major responsibility for saving what we can save, for mitigating the carbon emissions and their impact, and helping people around the world adapt to what's going on. And we cannot afford to have a generation of young people come of age, become adults feeling helpless to do anything about this. If we can't turn things around with this generation and show them that there are things they can do and help them truly understand our predicament and how we got here, then it's difficult to hope for a positive future.
Yeah. And Laura, you were gonna say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, one of the big barriers that I think is in existence on this issue right now is our lack of social and political will to get anything done is also driven by the fact that we're dealing with a whole lot of adults that never had the opportunity to learn about climate in school themselves. And actually, demonstrate significant amount of misconceptions about climate. I know I was one of them. I had a lot of the misconceptions myself, even though I went to great schools like Harvard. And I think actually admitting the fact that we might have some of these misconceptions is really challenging for adults to do. But actually thinking about the opportunity to leverage education for young people, whether that's educators in the classroom, whether it's parents talking at home with their kids, is a really powerful vehicle to help adults confront the misconceptions that they might have on this issue too. And we need to provide resources that meet people where they are and help them build understanding ahead.
Yeah, so speaking of what we all learned in school about climate and climate change, which for us is practically nothing compared to what we think the kids need now. I want to ask you a question about what counts these days as climate change literacy, because I think that too many adults, perhaps too many teachers, think that if you teach about the amplified greenhouse effect, that you've checked that box on climate change and there's nothing else really to teach about it, or everything else you can assume is common knowledge when it certainly is not. So what kinds of things should we include in climate change literacy? What do we want our kids to know about? Perhaps more importantly, be able to do by the time they go through the full K-12 trajectory of education. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, well, I could jump in. I don't like the term climate literacy because it speaks to education about the climate crisis, but not for a habitable planet, for the transition from fossil fuels to alternative sources of injury of sources of, let's see, let me go back. It speaks to education about the climate crisis rather than for the transition from fossil fuels to alternative sources of energy, for an end to fossil fuel emissions, and for climate justice. That's what we need to be educating for. And my book lays out a vision of what that education needs to look like. It starts with turning our classrooms into beloved communities where everyone belongs, where young people develop social emotional skills to handle the difficult feelings the crisis is going to bring, where they learn skills in developing trustworthy relationships with other people, where they're in a community that has their back as they try to figure out this world they're going into, and where they develop cultural, racial awareness and are encouraged to stand up for fairness and justice, right? So that's a foundation. They need to understand and love nature They need to get out into nature, and they need to understand how nature works and how we are part of nature. That's essential. Third, they need to have a deep understanding of the climate crisis, not just the science, though the science is crucial. And I applaud the many scientists around the world who have worked painstakingly to document and analyze the situation we're in. So science is really important, but to understand our predicament and how we got here, we need also to understand the economic and political social systems that are that are leading us to catastrophe. Above all, at the core, they need to practice and envision active hope. They need to practice active hope and envision a positive future. And there are plenty of examples of alternatives to the systems that we have that they can learn about and that can give hope. They need in school to have opportunities to make a difference in their local communities and beyond. That needs to be part of their schooling. And they need to learn the history of civil resistance, how so-called ordinary people have come together and turned the world and society toward justice. So all of those things need to be part of the education that they get. And in age-appropriate ways, that can happen and needs to happen pre-K through grades, actually 16.
I think I hear echoes of the civil rights movement in the last couple minutes of what you were talking about, Tom. There's lessons that we can bring forward today from the civil rights movement. So Laura, Tom mentioned a lot of things. Is there something you'd like to add to what should be part of it? Maybe a better phrasing of the question is, what should be an essential part of the curriculum K-12?
Yeah, I think the way that we've started to think about it a lot more is thinking about, okay, well, what is that basic climate understanding that everyone needs to have, regardless of what they do? And we've worked with the Nature Conservancy to distill that down into 4 essential climate principles. And I see somebody in here mentioned integrating Indigenous knowledge and traditional practices. And I know Tom got at this a little bit too. You know, the first and most important principle to understand, which I know for myself kind of went away at some point in my mind, is the fact that we depend on our climate and our environment to live the lives the way we do. I think oftentimes you're able to say, oh, humans were separate from, but actually, no, we are integrally a part of our environment and climate. So our first principle is really grounded in that and thinking about Earth as our home. And then, you know, thinking about our second principle is Earth is getting hotter right now because of us. And that's being impacted by 5 main sectors, burning fossil fuels for electricity, transportations, buildings, how we make stuff, you know, our processes on manufacturing, and our agriculture systems. You know, it is happening now, and that impacts us. Wet is wetter, hot is hotter, dry is drier, storms, wildfires, floods are more extreme. And then most importantly, but together we can advance the solutions we need to build a brighter future. And that can occur by reducing our impact on the environment, adapting to a changing climate, and building resilience, talking, learning, and communicating about this issue more all across our society. So those are kind of 4 basic climate understanding that we talk about as essential. And then we talk about how we need climate knowledge, and that's a deeper understanding of the way climate change works across systems and sectors. So we need doctors who understand how climate is impacting health. We need climate scientists to study what's going on with climate change. We need business leaders who understand how climate might impact their business model. So we need people with climate knowledge, and then we need people with climate skills is what we talk about in thinking about both how to think about and adapt to and prepare for instability. That's something that oftentimes we assume stability in our lives, but actually we need to go to being adaptable and thinking about how to prepare for instability. We need to think about how we both work individually and in community, and that's going to be essential to addressing climate change in the future. So the way that we really think about it is, that concept of what is climate understanding, what is climate knowledge, and then what are climate skills.
Mhm. You mentioned some of the professions that are going to be key in the future of a green economy, and a lot of students and a lot of adults may think, well, these are people who work on, again, referencing wind turbines, and they're going to have the jobs, and so the people's picture of the scope of a green economy or sustainable economy isn't quite as expansive as it should be. So I wrote down a list of some professions that are going to be impacted by the opportunities to work on climate change and sustainability. They include law, product design, urban planning, energy engineering, clothing design and recyclability, public health, communications, and the list goes on and on. The future economies that we're talking about that are sustainable and socially just, which is really important, involve nearly every sector of our economy. And so that should be part of what our children understand in a K-12 education. So I want to ask a question about bringing more teachers on board. In a recent NPR Ipsos poll of K-12 teachers, the teachers who indicate that they don't teach about climate change, 65% of them said that it wasn't related to the subject that they teach. How can we bring in teachers who don't think climate change is related to mathematics, English language arts, the performing arts, social studies, history, civics? How do we bring them in? Because when we highlight teachers in our respective books, for every teacher that we highlight, there's probably 10 teachers who are a little bit on the sideline and not engaged with climate change teaching. How do we get that enormous number of educators to take that leap?
Well, I think we can begin by showing them how it can be done. And for instance, in my book, Sochi, who, when I interviewed her, was teaching Latinx young people in the San Fernando Valley near Los Angeles. And she was teaching English language arts. And she points out that the English language arts curriculum and the standards are skills-based. So she realized that as long as she was teaching the kids their research skills, she could take them on field trips to into nature. And she worked with an organization called Tree People, and they took the kids on what were actually hikes. Some of the kids said, "Oh, I've never been on a hike before." And so they had a great experience of working with tree people to help build a sustainable, support tree people's efforts to develop a sustainable forest and environment there. And she also introduced the students to poems and literature that had to do with nature. And so she was able to find ways to communicate and have young people experience her love of nature as part of the ELA curriculum.
And I think just building on that, it's, to Tom's point at the end there, we need to meet educators where they are. And rather than say, hey, you've got to teach climate change, why not ask, what are you teaching? What is it that is a part of your curriculum? Oh, have you thought about fitting this in because it aligns? You know, my daughter is in kindergarten and they had a transportation unit where they were learning about cars. Well, talking to their teacher about, have you thought about talking about electric cars or how transportation runs on different things and what the trade-offs are on running on these different things? That makes it easy. And so I think really thinking about where teachers are, what they need to teach, and then finding those opportunities to weave this in is essential. You mentioned civics. And one of the things that I think is so remarkable right now is the fact that students all across the country are actually pushing their school boards on these policies and having that direct engagement in the civic process. I was just in Prince George's County last week, and I had the opportunity of talking with 2 students who made the case to their school board the night before about why they needed to change their policy related to some environmental issues. And that was a process for them. They had to figure out the problem, create the case, make their argument before the school board. Those are all civic learning, and the means by which they are doing it is related to climate and the environment. And so I think really thinking about what is it teachers need to teach and how we can weave this stuff in and make it easy is most important.
I just wanted to add quickly that Sochi is passionate about nature. She's actually a certified naturalist, and she loves being in nature, especially during the pandemic. She just felt like she had to go into nature to feed her soul. And so she was able to find a way to bring her passion into the ELA curriculum by getting her students into nature. And when the pandemic came along and they couldn't do the trips anymore, she still went into nature, met with the tree people, took videos of her work with them, and then brought it back to her kids. So she was very creative in the way she combined her passion and what she wanted to share with her students.
Yeah. I like the idea of having exemplary teachers doing this work and then documenting what it is they do. And what I'd like to hear more of in the future, and when people write about these exemplary teachers, is the challenges that they faced. Because often when we tell stories about great teachers, it seems like it was all very easy for them, when we know that no matter how skilled you are and how many years of experience you have as an educator, climate change teaching is just different than anything you've ever done. And there will be moments where you feel really vulnerable and that you're taking a big risk, or that things haven't panned out the way you thought, or kids have an emotional response that you don't feel you can handle. There's all kinds of things. I think those things need to be included when we do professional development with teachers, for example. So we're headed to the last 20 minutes, and I know that the audience always likes to ask questions, and there's a lot of things that we have not addressed. That shows you how big the territory is, right? That's why you need to buy and read the books. So Michael, I don't know, Michael or Peter, how are you going to funnel some questions our way from the audience?
Sure, yeah. We have a few questions here. One is, please talk a bit about why justice is so essential to engaging the challenges of climate change.
Well, I could jump in on that one. For one thing, and this came through very clearly from one of the young people that I interviewed for the book, Arte is his name. And he made the point that it's so important that we link climate and justice together, because of course they are linked. You know, the people around the world least responsible for the climate crisis are the first ones now. They're first in line to experience the impacts, and they're least prepared to adapt to those impacts. And also, many people of color are living in areas where the air is polluted. You know, there was Flint, Michigan, the water is polluted. And so Arte just made the point that that the climate crisis is not a white issue. It's not like, you know, it does seem that many of the climate activists, he talked about Greta Thunberg, you know, so we have, you know, a young white woman leading the way, but, and then people of color think that's not relevant to me. I've got too many problems as it is. Well, the two are one, and need to be seen as one. So it's really, we can't solve a climate crisis without having a unified movement that involves people across the spectrum. And so we need a movement for climate justice.
And I would add, just building onto that a little bit too, it's important to recognize the past and where we are in this moment. It's also really important to realize we're at a moment of societal transition, and we can use that as an opportunity to envision a better future. And I think we want that future where there is more justice, where, you know, right now our education system is inequitable. We have communities that have a lot, schools that have a lot, and schools that have less. And in the schools that have less, kids do not have the opportunity to, you know, be healthy. And that impacts their ability to learn, and it impacts their future economic success and potential. But because we're at this moment of societal transition, we can really focus on what we want for the future and build a pathway towards that better future. And that's one of the key reasons why we have to center justice in this as well. So it's recognizing and reckoning with the past where we've come from, but also thinking about what we really want in a healthy, sustainable society in the future.
So I'll touch upon a couple things that have already been said. One is we have to be honest about how we got here in the first place. The fossil fuels getting into our atmosphere is just one part of that origin story. But colonization, mostly of what was called the New World and the Global South, which continues today in different forms, colonization, hyper-capitalism, hyper-consumption, huge inequities in capital around the world are punishing the people least responsible for our climate change. And we have to recognize that without an emphasis on justice. There are no solutions. We've talked about a lot of solutions in the last hour. None of those solutions will work in the long term. They are not sustainable solutions unless they are addressing justice at the same time they're addressing other kinds of metrics about how successful some solution is going to be. Without justice, nothing is sustainable.
Laura alluded to this question earlier, but I'm just wondering if there's anything more to add to the question. How can we effectively integrate Indigenous knowledge and traditional practices into our climate change adaptation strategies to enhance resilience and sustainability?
I'm happy to jump in a little bit more on this too. I think it's important to recognize that I think it's Indigenous communities represent less than 5% of the population globally, but protect more than 80% of our natural, our remaining biodiversity and natural habitats. And I think, you know, when we think about adaptation and how we respond to our changing climate ahead, there is a lot that can be learned from Indigenous communities. And it is absolutely essential to partner with Indigenous communities when talking about solutions, and, you know, working with communities to best know how to work with the land in the places where they have continued and maintained this relationship with the land and the environment since time immemorial.
I just got back from a wonderful retreat for climate justice educators. And we spent 5 days in the Bree community of Costa Rica, in a community called Yorkin, and experienced their eco forest and their way of life, and also did workshops that are based on my book for the participants. There were 7 educators who joined me and Matt Cook, who's head of Latin American Service Expeditions. It's a wonderful trip that brought us firsthand with not only with indigenous practices, but also with their story of how they stood up to the United Fruit Company for their vision of the eco-forest and their respect for the land and their way of life. So that was a wonderful trip. We'll probably be doing more of trips like that, and educators just loved it. It was really an example of what education for climate justice can be. Other thing I'll mention is just that there's a wonderful organization, Indigenous Environmental Network, that is great to collaborate with. I mean, it would be good to explore collaboration with them.
And I want to add one thing to Tom and Laura's comments, because I know both Tom and Laura have written about the role of early education, of what should be taught in to younger kids in our K-12 system. And these indigenous worldviews, like the interdependence and mutual dependencies of all living things on all other living things, the decentering of humans from our visions of ecological systems, treating nature as a living thing, the land as a thing that is alive and worthy of our respect, not over-consuming, not creating waste. All of these things, Robin Wall Kimmerer says this all better than I've ever said it, but these are the kinds of things, when people ask, what can we teach our youngest learners, let's say preschool through 2nd grade, they can't be confronted with the hardest, most brutal aspects of climate change, but they can learn about these things in ways that engages them with the natural world, in ways that set the stage for later, more robust learning.
So Mark, that kind of leads into a question someone else had, which is, this person is in Ohio and they don't have any state standards about teaching climate change until high school. And the question is, do any of you have suggestions for how teachers can advocate for this content being added to the standards in their state?
I'm happy to jump in. I think, one thing that's important to do is state standards are one vehicle. And I think finding like-minded educators who also want to see this reflected in their state standards is critically important towards building this and getting this integrated more holistically. But I think it's also important to realize there are opportunities to teach it without it being in the state standards, and a lot of resources also available in that regard. And there are a lot of other policies that you can advocate for. State standard revisions come up not all that frequently. And so sometimes that can be a hard thing to get in on. But there are other models. Colorado last June passed a bill through their state legislature, which created a climate literacy seal on the high school diploma and allowed students who were taking specific courses and engaging in project-based learning related to climate change to qualify for a climate literacy seal. And gave a very small amount of the climate literacy seal out last year because the bill had just passed, and this is their first year of full implementation. And they're already anticipating hundreds and hundreds of students who have opted in to getting this seal, which then means it's also in the curriculum. So even if standards are a goal, there might be policy vehicles and opportunities to get things ahead that might not be all the way to the standards. But I think the biggest thing is about finding other teachers within your community, finding parents as allies and students as allies who want to see this happen to advance the conversation.
Right, I agree. And, in addition to standards, there are conditions in our schools that make it difficult to give kids a great education of any kind, let alone one on climate justice. The classes are too big. There aren't enough mental health services for students, families, and teachers. The teaching to the test, all of that takes away from educators' freedom to give our students the education we know that they need. And so it's important that educators organize, do deep organizing in their schools and in their communities, to fight for and develop the power to demand the freedom and resources to give our kids a great education. I'm very heartened by the Chicago Teachers Union that just signed a contract that involves raises for the teachers, good raises for the teachers, smaller class sizes, and decarbonization of schools and education to go along with that. If a school is decarbonizing, that's a great mitigation strategy. And along with that can go education of the students. This is what we're doing. This is why it's happening. And maybe the students can help. And it's not going to come from above. It's not going to come from the president, certainly. It needs to come from grassroots, deep organizing on the part of educators, parents, and people in the community.
Yeah, and how about let's get some input from the kids themselves. The kids are going to want to know. They have their phones and they see the words climate change and they see videos just the same as adults do. And then when we don't teach about it, that's what we used to call the null curriculum. It means the kids notice that something is not at all anywhere in the curriculum. For years, they don't hear about climate change. That sends a strong message. But kids can actually push they can take action. We can teach kids how to take action, to lobby a school department like the biology department. Aren't there opportunities left and right to integrate climate change ideas into a biology curriculum at the sophomore level? Every ecosystem on Earth is impacted by climate change, right? So
Yes.
kids can advocate. We need to teach. I mean, this might be the last thing we talk about, but kids need to advocate for themselves and we can help them advocate for themselves. It helps kids if they think that some trusted adults in their lives have their back. I think I've heard Tom say that, and I know Laura has written about it. Adults having their back makes a big difference for kids and how we can get them to take action.
Mark, just building on that point that you just raised, there was one young woman that I worked with. Her name was Nana. She grew up in Ann Arbor, and her grandparents on one side almost lost their house in the Gatlinburg fire in Tennessee. Her grandparents on the other side almost lost their house in Bihar, India, due to flooding. And she was starting to get really freaked out and then would go to school and nobody was talking about this issue or diminishing it or keeping it under wraps. And she started to feel like she was crazy for being worried about it because the people that she looked to for knowledge and answers weren't talking about it. And I think that's just critically important for us to realize young people aren't just passively experiencing climate change, they're living it. And we have an opportunity to either help them navigate that or not. So,
Right. I think one of the best ways to support students and empower them to take action is to mentor a climate club in your school. The young people that I interviewed certainly benefited greatly from being a part of such a club. And also, they said, you know, just like if they express that they are taking action in some way, it just means a lot to them for a teacher to say, that's great. Is there any way I can support you? So sometimes just as simple as that.
There's a kind of question about that, which is, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but just a quick question about whether any of you know of student network, not just websites connecting students at schools, but someone had a question of whether there's like a student-run network that connects students kind of across geography. You know, between schools or between states or between countries. Is that
Well,
any?
there's the Sunrise movement. There's Fridays for Future. And I think the Sunrise movement is a national organization, so that's something to look into. Not familiar with their current activities, but in New York City, there's you know, the Climate and Resilience Education Task Force, and there's a strong youth steering committee there. Several dozen young people who've been lobbying in Albany for climate education. And so that would be a good group to connect with too, and they'll know of other young people's organizations.
I also know of both the American Conservation Coalition is one young conservative group around advocating on climate, and the ACE, which is the Alliance for Climate Emergency, and they are also around connecting young people on climate-related work.
Well, thank you all. There are more questions, but we have run out of time. So, but Tom, Laura, and Mark, thank you so much. And thank you everyone who came and watched the webinar. We'll be sending a link to the recording out to everyone who registered, whether they made it or not. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.